Welcome to my messy studio, everyone. My name is Mark, and I'm an artist and an art professor. And in this video, I'm going to show you 3 fast sketching techniques in pen and ink, pen and wash, and then wash all by itself. These will be useful to those of you who wish to draw something very quickly or do concept or compositional studies for your larger projects. Let's get started. I'm by no means a scholar of the history of art instruction, but it seems to me that rapid drawing was de-emphasized in 19th century academies, with greater import placed on slow, methodical ways of drawing that produced highly finished work. While the value of doing academic studies with a full range of contrast cannot be disputed, there are many situations where a high degree of finish is not desired, and where a rapid approach is much more appropriate. To that end, I strongly believe that artists must not limit themselves by doing only long drawings, but must train in a variety of timescales, short, medium, and long. Fast drawings, in many ways, are actually quite difficult to do well. Not only because you don't have time to correct, but because you have to be very selective about what to include, and details have to be suggested rather than fully rendered. So let's talk about what should be included and what can be left out. And in order to do that, we need to talk a little bit about what elements in a drawing create a sense of form. In this fully rendered drawing of a sphere and cube, we see 2 kinds of shadows being depicted: body shadows and cast shadows. Body shadows, so called because they sit on the body of the form, have either a soft or hard edge, depending on whether the shape is curved, like a sphere, or rectilinear, like a cube. Within the shadow, there are 2 additional values we need to pay attention to: the darker value here and here, which is called the core shadow, and then the reflected light here and here. These 3 properties of the body shadow, the softness and hardness of the edge, the core shadow, and the reflected light, are key to creating the illusion of form, and academic artists pay close attention to them when trying to make a realistic, fully rendered work of art. As for the cast shadows, these also have 3 properties. The first of which is that cast shadows usually have sharp edges where they start. The second is that they tend to soften as they move away from the casting object. The third property is that cast shadows are usually darkest at the point of origin, where they make contact with the form that's casting it, and get lighter as they move away from the casting object. And lastly, we have the lighter area of the sphere and the cube, which also have 3 properties. We have the highlight, the general light, and then on round objects, this fuzzy area right before the light transitions into shadow, which is called the halftone. When shading, it's important to pay close attention to the 3 properties of body shadow, the 3 properties of cast shadow, and the 3 properties of light. But do we really need this degree of finish to create the illusion of 3-dimensional form? We don't. What we do need is to suggest the presence of those properties, but this does not have to be done with a full range of value or with a high degree of finish. In fact, it can be done with a very limited value range, and this can be done quickly. For example, if I were to do a quick drawing of a sphere, I would indicate the light break, like so, and then put down a body shadow, and make sure that the body shadow has a little bit of a soft transition, which tells the viewer that we're dealing with a round form. Now I need to put a core shadow in. So core shadow is going to be a little bit darker than the general value of the body shadow. It's going to follow the shape of the light break. Here's our core shadow. And then, to get the reflected light, all I need to do is put in some indication of the cast shadow, because the darkness of the cast shadow here will make this area look lighter and make it feel like a reflected light. So for cast shadows, I also need to check off those 3 properties. So I want to make sure that the cast shadow is sharper at the beginning, where it starts, and then starts fuzzying it out, starts softening as it moves away from the casting object, like so, and that it's darker at the point of origin, and then starts to get a little bit lighter. As you can hopefully see, this little sketch, while lacking the contrast and high finish of the longer drawing, nevertheless appears three-dimensional. Why? Because the basic properties which suggest form are there. The ability to suggest form through incredibly minimal means can be exploited in a variety of sketching techniques, which I'm going to show you right now. The first two techniques exploit the fact that the core shadow always runs along the edge of the body shadow and can be used to indicate its shape. For example, on this sphere, the light break runs about here, like this, which means the core shadow is going to follow the same crescent path. This means that if I put down the core shadow, paying close attention to the fact that it's thinner here, and then gets a little bit wider, gets a little bit more diffused towards the center, and then gets, again, a little bit narrower towards the edges, that'll give me a very good indication of what the shape of the shadow is. And then, if I put down a second, longer hatch and push it slightly past the core, that's going to give me the impression that we have a soft transition from light to shadow. So I'm going to change the angle a little bit and extend my hatching a little bit beyond my core shadow, like this. Now let's fill in the rest of the body shadow. And then you can see just in 2 strokes I've accomplished a lot. I have my soft transition, I've got a core shadow, and then to get the indication of reflected light, all we have to do is put in my cast shadow. Paying attention to the 3 properties. The fact that cast shadows are darker, and that they get a little bit lighter as they move away from the casting object, and that they get also a little bit softer as they move away from the casting object. So a little bit sharper here, and a little bit darker here. The contrast between the darker cast shadow and the lighter value here gives us the impression of a reflected light. This 2-step process, requiring no more than 2 hatch layers, can be done with any of the hatching techniques: parallel hatching, cross hatching, and what I'm doing here, cross contour hatching. Let's do a drawing using this technique. I'm going to start putting in the lines. And while I put in the lines, let's talk about line quality, because line is also another super efficient way of recording information in an ultra condensed way. So one of the things I can record in my line is whether the form is in light or in shadow. So for example, light is coming from this direction, and we have shadow all the way along this side of the body. I can use a heavier line there to record that information. And on the lighter side of the form, I can use a lighter line. Line can also be used to emphasize what's in front and what's further away. So for example, this leg is closer, this leg is further away. So when I put in the line here, I'm going to use a heavier line. Here the form is in shadow, so I'm going to use a darker line. And this leg I'm going to make a little bit lighter in terms of line quality anyway, to show the fact that it's farther away. So if you look at a lot of old master sketches, one of the things that is absolutely brilliant about them is the way they use line quality to record all kinds of very specific information. So here we have shadow. I'm going to use a darker line. Line can also be used to indicate the surface. So for example, on a softer surface, like a leg muscle, I'll use a softer line. And then on bonier surfaces, on harder structures, I can use a heavier line to emphasize the hardness. So this foot, for example, is closer to us. I'm going to use a heavier line here. This foot is a little farther away. I can use a lighter line. This form is in shadow, then it starts going into light, and then this form is really far away. So I'm going to use a very light line here to show its distance. Now, generally speaking, for the inside of the form, I'm going to use either lines that are very, very light, or I can use stipples or hatching. I want to avoid sharp lines on areas where I'm not really seeing line, I'm seeing more halftone. So for example, that separation between the breast and the sternum. And I'm going to avoid a sharp line there. On the outside of the form, however, you can use lines and use them to record all kinds of information. Okay, let me put in the facial features. I'm going to use reverse writing here. That's going to allow me to put down a much finer line. And then for the hair, I'm going to switch to a thicker line to show a difference in texture. So I'm going to use a heavier line here. One of the keys to drawing quickly is to not sacrifice specificity when you're doing the drawing. So I'm not simplifying anything. I'm being as specific to the contour as possible. I'm recording it quickly, but I'm not simplifying. Why? Because specific detail is more interesting than things that are generalized. And the more specific I can be in a condensed way, the more interesting the drawing is. Okay, so I'm going to start shading. Before I start rendering, I'm going to put in a very clear indication of where my core shadows are. So they're going to run here, running this way. Here's the core shadow. What I'm doing actually is figuring out the shape of the light break. Right? Core shadows follow the shape of the shadow edge. So it runs this way. And I'm being as specific about this information as I can. So even though I'm working quickly, even though this is going to be a sketch, I'm not simplifying. I'm trying to be as specific to the shape as possible. So here we have the superior anterior iliac crest. There's a little bump right there. Here we have a more rounded form, the quads. Here we have a cast shadow. Here we have a body shadow. Here we have another cast shadow running this way. Those are going to have sharp edges when we get to them. Here we have a little halftone and cast shadow, body shadow. Then we have the structures of the ankle, bunch of bones. Another cast shadow here, another body shadow going down. The arm is partially in shadow here. We have a little bit of a body shadow here. The next step is to hatch the core shadow. Again, be specific. Be quick, but be specific. So we have a very narrow, very, very narrow core shadow here that could almost be a stipple like this. It's very narrow here. Again, on narrow forms where you have abrupt shifts, the core shadow is going to be very condensed and pretty thin. Where the forms start getting more rounded, the core shadow diffuses over a larger area and becomes a little bit lighter, a little bit wider. Be specific about the shape of the core. The more specific you can be, the better your sketch is going to be. The more interesting the sketch, the more information the sketch records. Okay, so here we have a body shadow. Here we have a core shadow. We can put a little bit of a line there to emphasize its sharpness relative to the body shadow. And as the form becomes a little bit curvier, a little bit wider, we're going to open up the core. And then sharpen it up again here because we have a little sharp bone. And then widen it again. The shape of the core shadow, just like the edge of the light break, tells us a lot about what's happening on the form. It is a really good indicator of whether the form is very gently curving or has an abrupt edge to it. Don't treat all the core shadows as if they all have the same width or the same value. Be specific. Now, when it comes to cast shadows, we're going to put in a little bit of a line. That is a simplification because cast shadows start a little bit sharper, they start diffusing a little bit, but most cast shadows on the human body are relatively short. There's not going to be a huge amount of variation in edge. So here we have a gently curving form. We're going to open up the core shadow to indicate that we're dealing with a rounder object. Cast shadow and body shadow running all the way down the length of the shin until we start going sharp again because we have a bunch of very, very sharp bony structures here. Okay, cast shadow and cast shadow. Got a long core shadow running here, like so. This might also be a good time to indicate a little bit some of the structures of the knees. What else? The belly button, maybe. Okay, let's do a little bit of the face. So once again, we've got a body shadow running here. I can see a core running this way, like this, and then here we have a cast shadow. There's a little gentle cast shadow underneath the nose, inside the eye sockets here. Okay, all right, so now I'm ready to put down my body shadow. Again, keep in mind, body shadows on round objects have diffused edges, so we want to push the body shadow a little bit past my core to give the impression that we're dealing with a soft transition. So I'm going to change the angle a little bit of my hatch and push my hatching ever so slightly past the core. So once again, we have a soft transition, we have a core shadow, and then this lighter value looks like a reflected light. We have all of the requirements of form, even though we don't have a full range of value. Again, we don't need a full range of value in order to create a sense of three-dimensionality. All we need are those three properties of body shadow. Okay, let's run down the form here. So again, here we have a rounder shape, the shoulder, the deltoid. Right? We're going to move the hatch a little bit further forward to get a little bit more of a sense of transition. Right? So here the hatch pushes a little bit more past the core shadow. I'm constantly looking, I never stop looking, I never stop responding. So even though this is a fast sketch, I'm still being specific. So here we have some bony structures. We have the ribs. Those edges are quite sharp. So in this case I run the hatch pretty close to the core shadow. Where things start getting more rounded, I push the hatch a little bit more. So just like the core shadow is not the same thickness all the way through, there's also variation in the body shadow. So here the forms are a little bit more rounded. I push the body shadow a little bit more past the core to get a slightly softer transition. Here we have the superior anterior iliac crest. It's a bony protrusion against the skin. Here I run the hatch marks right up against the core. That's going to give the impression that we're dealing with something that's boxy. And then once again, we're back to something that's a little more rounded. In fact, that's probably, this shape here is probably the most rounded thing in the figure right now. In this case, we're going to push that hatch even more past the core shadow. I might have to do this in 2 parts. Okay, so we're a more rounded form, and I pushed the body shadow a little further forward. That's going to give me a softer transition. So let's do the same thing here. Here again, we have a very rounded form. Let's see if we can create that impression of roundness in just 2 layers of hatch. Okay, now when you're dealing with cast shadows have sharp edges. So in those cases, we're going to run the hatch mark all the way up to the edge of the line. So let's do the same thing here. Okay, now we're going to fill in the rest of this area. Now the shadow area doesn't need to have a lot of detail. You can put in a little bit of additional detail into it if you want. But generally speaking, details and shadows are very soft. Why? Because you need light to see detail. You need light to see texture. So by keeping the shadows very, very simple, it actually makes them look fairly realistic. Again, we can put additional details in. We can put down another layer. It depends how much time you have. Right? That's going to be up to you. However, for very, very fast sketches, just 1 layer is going to be enough for the shadows. It's going to make them recede into the darkness and look like shadows. Okay, so here the form is a little bit more abrupt, so I'm going to run the hatch just a little bit past the core. You can see just in 2 layers I have recorded quite a bit of information about what's happening, right? Whether the form is gently curving or sharp and abrupt. Right? I also said something about the light source, so here we're dealing with really strong light. Okay, so let's put in a little bit more detail in the face. So here we have fairly gentle curve. Cast shadow, a little bit of shadow inside the eyes, and we have a sharp cast shadow underneath the jaw. Okay, so I can also introduce a little bit of shading to the hair. I can make the hair darker. And the next step is up to you. So probably if I had a little bit more time, so a time range of, let's say, 10 minutes, maybe even running into 20 minutes, I might spend a little bit more time rendering the lighter values. So I can start putting in a little bit of the halftones here. Just to show that there's a little bit of detail in the lighter parts as well. Again, for this type of work, mostly the focus is on the shadows. As long as you can get the shadows, you're going to have three-dimensional form. Everything else is secondary. So let's put in a little bit of additional detail. We have some delicate halftones here. A little more detail in the face. Again, how much detail you include is up to you. So at this point, I can go in and maybe adjust a few lines. I can, in some places, make the core shadows a little bit darker. So put down a third layer if I want. But again, in 2 layers, 3 layers, I've recorded quite a lot of information. So maybe the last thing I'm going to do is put in the cloth here. Again, even though this is a fast drawing, I'm working from observation and being specific about the shapes I'm drawing.